On Tuesday, March 12th, the afternoon shift entered the cleanroom in Santa Clara, as if passing through the wall of an aquarium. Double interlocked doors, the positive pressure anteroom, the continuous breath of HEPA-filtered air, cold lights reflected by white vinyl and stainless steel. In there, what was small was never just small. A detail out of place could become a major loss. A poorly tied-off end of shift could become a gap in an internal audit. A cart parked where it shouldn't be could become a chain of rushed decisions. An incomplete entry in the log could become, weeks later, the question no one wanted to answer. And many times, it was an ordinary person who carried that weight without anyone in upper management knowing the name. In that corridor of the diffusion module, an operator named Eduardo Dudu Martins heard a joke that seemed light and, precisely because of that, got stuck. A new supervisor, brought in from a consultancy in San Jose, tried to explain that the company was going to modernize routines. Someone asked where the whistle would be, like in the old factories. She laughed, a short laugh that got lost behind the mask and hood, and replied that there is no whistle here. The operators laughed too, a shrugging laugh, because the cleanroom had no space for nostalgia or for loud sound that could be mistaken for an equipment alarm. But that night, before the sun dropped behind the rows of eucalyptus near US 101, Dudu already felt that, without a common signal to mark the end, something could come loose. And when it came loose, the price would not fall on those who signed memos. It would fall on people with rent to pay and children to pick up, people who didn't appear on org charts or in productivity presentations. The plant sat on a wide, uncharming street, surrounded by low office buildings and cracked asphalt parking lots, like so many in Silicon Valley in the 1990s, with narrow sidewalks and little shade beyond the trees planted in a line. There was a discreet sign with the company name, and at the gate, a security guard who recognized cars by the sound of the engine and the parking sticker on the windshield. Outside, life had the ordinary texture of any workers. Lunches in insulated bags, children picked up from daycares in Sunnyvale, bills paid at the Bank of America counter at the mall, quick shopping at the Lucky near home, receipts saved to reconcile with the statement at the end of the month. Inside, time was made of something else. The ventilation system's noise never stopped. The machines had their own cycles. The watch on the wrist stayed hidden under the coverall sleeve and under gloves because metal and dust were watched. Even so, until that March, the end of shift had a known rhythm, almost physical. At 3:50 p.m., the team began preparing the handoff, filling paper logs and traveler forms that followed the lot, writing in black pen the wafer lot number and the process step, checking that the quartz drawers were in place and the lids were seated, verifying labels and times, leaving a list of pending items on the corridor whiteboard with abbreviations only those who lived there understood. At 4 p.m., a yellow light came on above a door, visible even through the polycarbonate window, and a discreet alarm vibrated on the line leader's pagers, those rectangular devices clipped to the belt. It was the closest thing they had to a whistle, not a loud sound but a common signal. To someone listening from outside, it seemed silent. To them, it was enough because it gathered eyes, aligned hands, gave the day an edge, and reduced the space for interpretation. Dudu was 34 and lived in Milpitas, in a two-bedroom apartment near North Milpitas Boulevard, where the smell of the neighbor's Mexican food mixed with the rice and beans he brought in containers, and where the parking lot had numbered spaces and tow-away warnings. He had come from Brazil at the end of the 1980s on a student visa and stayed, learning to orient himself more by routine than by promises, doing what many did: steady work, health insurance tied to the badge, bills paid on time. He wasn't an engineer and didn't dream of being one. He learned with his hands and through repetition, following written procedures and what the older workers taught without ceremony. At the plant, he was a cleanroom operator in the photolithography module, a precision job that allowed no distraction, loading wafers into cassettes, positioning them in aligners, watching through a protective window the ultraviolet flash that drew invisible patterns, controlling exposure times, and checking that the resist had been applied without flaws. At every step, the risk of contamination was a silent enemy. A hair, a speck of dust, a drop of oil, and an entire lot became scrap. And scrap and wafers wasn't just material. It was tool time, lost capacity, a report, a question. The place's vocabulary was made of acronyms and warnings: particle count, yield, rework, hold, scrap. Their lives were measured in percentages, but held up by small certainties. The path to the glove cabinet, the rack's fit, the signal that said when one part ended and another began, and the practical idea that the process needed a beginning, middle, and end so it wouldn't turn into improvisation. In the cafeteria, before the shift, conversations were about simple things, as if simple were a way to keep the ground firm. In March, they talked about El Niño, which had battered California in winter and left news of flooding in Northern California. They talked about rents rising in San Jose. They talked about traffic on I-880, the accidents that jammed the bridge, and the time lost in lines. And they talked more and more about what the company called reengineering, a word that appeared in printed emails taped to bulletin boards beside safety notices and production targets. A co-worker of Dudu's, Hector Jimenez, who lived in East San Jose and always brought sliced oranges in a plastic bag, said it was outsourcing under another name. An older technician, Linda Cho, from metrology with small, steady hands, said it was just a fashion of the moment, like total quality before it, with its charts and meetings. What everyone felt, without saying, was that Silicon Valley in 1996 seemed to be always running, and whoever didn't run along became leftover. It wasn't an abstract feeling. It was the list of more expensive apartments, the gasoline, the daycare car, the DMV line, and the certainty that there would always be someone willing to take the same badge for less, especially in floor roles treated as replaceable. The consultancy arrived in blocks. Men in light blue shirts, black folders, a way of looking at people as if they were steps in a flowchart, and of taking notes without lifting their heads. At first, they mapped movements. How many steps to the glove cabinet? How many seconds to open the airlock door? How many times someone went back because they forgot an allowed item? Then they began to talk about reducing redundancies and optimizing shifts, as if redundancy were always waste and never protection. On April 25th, a Thursday with a clear sky, the company announced that sectors would be outsourced: general cleaning, cafeteria, facilities maintenance, and part of the logistics support inside the plant. The notice came on letterhead, handed out in person, followed by a quick meeting in the auditorium, where the air conditioning seemed colder than necessary and the chairs creaked when someone moved. There were no shouts. There was a silence full of calculation. Who would stay? Who would leave? Who would be absorbed by a contracted company? And under what conditions? With what uniform and what supervisor? The silence, there was a way of measuring risk. That week, as the announcement circulated, the whistle joke returned like something too light for the weight it carried. "There is no whistle here," they repeated, and some laughed, but it was no longer a shrugging laugh. The common end-of-shift signal, the yellow light, and the pager also went onto the list of things to review. A consultant said it was a remnant of shop floor culture and that the new structure of autonomous teams could manage their own closures. The phrase spread, repeated by a mid-level manager in the corridor, and somehow became an administrative truth before it became a safe practice. On Monday, May 6th, the yellow light did not come on. The leader's pagers did not vibrate. Nothing sounded, nothing blinked. Only the filtered air, always the same, and people trying to guess when the day officially ended without a marker that belonged to everyone. The operators noticed gradually, as if the body needed time to accept that a certainty had been removed. At 3:58 p.m., Hector looked at the watch tucked in his coverall pocket and gestured to Dudu. Linda, on the other side, raised her eyes and searched for the reflection of the light on the ceiling, finding none. The handoff routine hung, suspended for a few minutes, as if everyone were waiting for someone to give a command. But no one did. The new organization said each cell would take care of itself. But the cells had no visible walls. There were people moving between machines, sharing the same corridor, the same stock of cassettes, the same air, and sharing as well the consequences when something went out of spec. When one group began to close, another was still in the middle of a critical process. The whiteboard received conflicting information. A wafer lot sat on a bench longer than it should have, waiting for someone who assumed someone else would come. And there, waiting time was not neutral. It was accumulated risk without a signature. At first, the impact was small, almost an irritation swallowed to keep the rhythm. A supervisor walked by and told them to adjust. Dudu, who had learned to survive in places where no one explained everything, tried to manufacture his own signal. At 3:45 p.m., he began checking his logs even if the machine was still running, and mentally separated what needed to be written so it wouldn't become doubt later. But there was always a last-minute request, a mass change, a particle alarm that required rechecking and recording. Without the common signal, the end of shift stopped being an edge and became a blur. Some days, the team left 20 minutes late. On others, they left too early, leaving the next shift to discover pending items with anger and with the kind of hurry that increases error. The pressure, which had previously come only from the equipment, began to come from people, a pressure without shape, spread in the corridor like static. And precisely because it had no shape, it appeared in no consultancy chart. In mid-May, Outsourcing took on substance in different uniforms. The contracted facilities company brought new people into the outer corridors and for trash collection. In the cafeteria, plates changed size, the coffee got weaker, and restocking became irregular, as if even the break had been optimized. Cleaning of non-critical areas began to be done by workers who didn't know the building the way someone knows a house, nor the circulation limits the way someone learns them through repetition. It wasn't their fault. They had hurry and instructions. But hurry, there was a danger. The cleanroom operator knew that the boundary between non-critical and critical was a line of tape on the floor and a sign on the wall, and that dust respected neither tape nor sign nor org chart. What was outside could become inside in seconds. It only took a door opening at the wrong moment. On June 3rd, a Monday with morning fog that dissolved before noon, the kind of thing happened that no one puts in a notice. A trash cart, one of those gray ones with a lid, was left for a few minutes in a corridor near the cleanroom anteroom of the photolithography module. The cart did not enter the cleanroom, but it was close enough that when the door opened for a team to exit, an air current dragged particles into the anteroom. The particle counter showed an increase, with numbers rising too fast to ignore. The alarm sounded discreetly, and procedure required stopping operations, doing a sweep, recording the event, and identifying a possible source. Dudu was in the middle of a cassette change when he heard the alert. The team stopped, looked at the numbers on the panel, and by instinct looked for a supervisor. The supervisor who used to be there had been reassigned. In his place, there was a cell coordinator responsible for two areas at once and in a meeting far from the corridor. The absence was not only of a person, it was of a ready decision. The protocol said to isolate, record, wait for authorization. But time was money in wafers, and the new autonomy talk weighed like a shove, as if responsibility had been pushed downward without the corresponding tools. Hector, an informal leader, made a hand gesture, as if trying to close the issue before it grew. They would handle it right there, clean the anteroom, restart the flow, as if the problem were only visible and immediate. Dudu hesitated. He knew photolithography was sensitive, that restarting without a full assessment could mask contamination that would only appear days later as a yield drop, when it would no longer be possible to go back to the corridor and point to the cart. He also knew that if they delayed the schedule, the finger would point at the floor, not at the consultancy. Morality at that moment had no form of speech. It had the form of a tired body and a simple memory. The common end-of-shift signal, the yellow light, had been removed because someone thought it was too old. If that could be removed, what else could be removed without anyone noticing until it became loss? Dudu made a small decision and, at the same time, a heavy one. He left the anteroom, removed his gloves with the usual care, went to the landline phone in the outer corridor, and called the EHS office, the Safety and Hygiene Department, which had formal authority to clear an area and record in nonconformance. He asked for someone to come measure and formally release the area. He did not ask Hector or the coordinator for permission. He simply recorded the occurrence under his name, as if the name were a stamp that doesn't erase. When he returned, Hector made an irritated gesture and pointed to the line of lots waiting. Linda, called in a rush, looked at Dudu with a look that was neither judgment nor support. It was the look of someone watching another person cross an invisible line. In Silicon Valley in 1996, crossing invisible lines was a way to lose a job, even when the line was the procedures. The EHS technician arrived in 25 minutes, with a portable meter and a pad of forms, and with the posture of someone who knows paper becomes archive. He confirmed the counter had risen beyond the limit and required a full cleaning and the replacement of a filter, with time recorded and signature. Production stopped for almost 2 hours. The coordinator appeared, sweating under his tie, and asked for explanations. Dudu explained in short sentences, pointing to the panel and the anteroom, without adjectives, like someone who knows adjectives become argument and argument becomes blame. The coordinator did not shout. He took notes and said they would talk later. That day, when the end of shift arrived, no one knew exactly when it was. The clock read 4 p.m., but there was still a machine down, a report to fill out, a filter to install, and a chain of records to close. Without whistle, without light, without pager, time stretched and became debt, and the debt stayed in the body. The following week, corridor talk began, the kind that doesn't need proof to have effect. One rumor said the company was trimming and that anyone who created friction would be marked. Another said the consultancy had cost reduction targets and that if yield fell, they would cut floor staff to compensate because it was the easiest cut to justify. Dudu began to be called, behind his back, the by-the-book guy. Hector stopped sharing oranges. Linda kept talking to him, but cautiously, as if words could be recorded too, as if the corridor had heard and kept them. On June 18th, Dudu was called to HR into a room with gray carpet and an artificial plant in the corner, with stacked folders and a wall clock that measured time in another way. They said there would be no termination, but there would be a warning for not following the chain of command and for interrupting production without alignment. The warning came with a required signature and a training phrase, responsible empowerment. Dudu signed because signing was what you did when rent came due every month and health insurance came from the same place, and because refusing to sign rarely changed the text. It only changed the risk. At the end of June, outsourcing brought more changes, and each change seemed to push responsibility a little further toward the most fragile place. Internal logistics began to be handled by a contracted company whose workers wore vests with another logo. They moved cassettes and boxes through corridors that had once had a known rhythm, and rhythm there was part of control. One day, One of them left a cardboard box leaning against a cart of clean materials. The box did not enter the clean room, but it was close enough for an operator to complain because cardboard was, by rule, a source of fiber and dust. The operator complained to whom? There was no longer a fixed supervisor. Each team had a coordinator who was always somewhere else, in a meeting or covering another area. The absence of a common sound, of an end marker, spread like habit. If there was no whistle to stop, it also seemed there was no whistle to say, "This can't be." People still knew what was right, but the path to do what was right grew longer, with more steps and fewer responsible faces, and response time became part of the problem. On July 9th, a Tuesday of dry heat, the irreversible happened without a bang. It was close to 4:30 p.m., and the afternoon shift should already have handed the line to the night shift. But the handoff was delayed because an alignment machine was showing an intermittent error, the kind that appears and disappears and leaves the operator uncertain, as if the equipment itself hesitated. The maintenance technician who used to cover photolithography was now from an outsourced company and covered plants in the region, running between Santa Clara and Fremont, with a schedule driven by service calls. He arrived late and, after evaluating the equipment, asked them to shut it down and wait, following what could be done without a part in stock. While they waited, a wafer lot sat in an open rack, with a lid poorly seated because someone from the next shift had already arrived and was trying to get ahead on work. No one noticed that, at that hour, the anteroom door was being opened and closed with unusual frequency. People coming and going because the end of shift had never been officially declared. The air tried to compensate, but the system was not built for human indecision, nor for a flow of people without cadence. The cleanroom could filter particles. It could not filter confusion. When the machine came back, the lot was processed. The patterns were exposed. The chemicals reacted. The microscopic lines were drawn. Everything seemed normal, the way many contamination failures seem at the moment they happen. Silent, with no visible sign, with no alarm that says now. But days later, in electrical test, the chips from that lot showed cascading failures. Yield plunged. It wasn't a failure you fixed with a screwdriver. It was contamination, a defect printed into silicon, multiplied across thousands of units, and appearing too late to be clearly tied to the exact minute. The entire lot was marked as scrap. The loss was large enough to trigger meetings that did not include operators. Meetings with charts and questions that already carried an answer inside them, as if the goal were to close the case, not to understand the corridor. The company reacted the way companies react, looking for somewhere to hang responsibility. The internal report mentioned procedure failure in shift change and nonconformance in rack handling, in compliance language and without names from above. It did not mention the removal of the common signal. It did not mention the outsourcing that had fragmented attention and lengthened response time. On Friday, July 26th, on a day when the coastal fog did not reach Santa Clara and the sky stayed hard and blue, Dudu came in for a shift and found a wake-like atmosphere without a body. Hector was not there. Linda was there, but her face looked paler under the light. The coordinator called Dudu and two other operators for a quick talk. He said the company needed to show action and that there would be immediate adjustments, as if adjustments were always painless things, and as if the cost always fell on the same side, always on the floor. The following Monday, July 29th, Hector was fired. There was no public announcement. Only the disappearance of his badge, the absence of his name on the schedule board, the orange that didn't appear in the cafeteria. They said he had violated storage protocol and created contamination risk. Hector had small children and high rent in East San Jose. The firing was irreversible like a clean cut. There was no union appeal. There was no whistle to call everyone and say it was unjust, and HR treated it as case closure. Some people avoided commenting, afraid of being associated. Others commented in low voices in the parking lot, near cars warmed by the late afternoon sun. Dudu heard someone say Hector had been the example. The word hung in the air like dust, and for a few days no one moved beyond what was necessary, as if extra movement could become evidence against them. From then on, the cleanroom's human texture changed. Those who stayed grew quieter. Shifts began to overlap out of necessity, but without coordination. People arrived earlier and left later, trying not to leave loose ends that could become a reason, and they wrote down more than before, not out of diligence, but out of defense. Without a common end signal, the day did not end. It was simply abandoned when someone decided they had done enough not to be blamed. Dudu began bringing a small kitchen timer, the kind you twist and that makes a low ticking sound, and kept it in the outer locker. He couldn't bring it into the clean room, but he used it before putting on the coverall. He set 3:40 p.m. as the start of his personal closeout. It was a way to manufacture a private whistle, a domestic edge in a place that pretended edges were waste and time could be stretched at no cost, as if people were elastic too. In August, the company implemented a communication improvement program. They posted posters with arrows and words like handoff, accountability, and generic instructions about recording status, as if the problem were only a lack of posters and not a lack of structure. They created a shared spreadsheet on an old computer in the corridor, where each team was supposed to record the state of machines and lots, with fields that froze when someone forgot to save. The problem was that the spreadsheet depended on discipline, and discipline does not come from a poster when the floor is afraid and when the end of shift has no mark. Linda, always methodical, tried to make the system work. She wrote in small, legible handwriting, noting exact times, double-checking before saving, and verifying that what was on paper matched what was on the screen. Dudu helped when he could and, without saying it out loud, began doing something simple, repeated, almost invisible. Before leaving, he checked whether what was on the whiteboard and what was in the spreadsheet said the same thing. It wasn't an official task, but it was the kind of care that kept someone on the next shift from opening the wrong rack or repeating a step by mistake. And it was also a way to restore some continuity to the corridor, like someone stitching an edge that had been torn. On September 4th, a Wednesday with hot wind coming from inland, an old supervisor returned to the corridor for a few hours, as if the company suddenly remembered that people needed edges and presence. He brought a small device that flashed a red light at 4 p.m. and at midnight, marking shift ends. It wasn't official. It didn't come in notice. It was a patch attempt, placed so as not to draw attention from those who had decided the whistle was a thing of the past. Some operators felt relief, because the body recognizes a limit when it returns. Others felt anger, because it proved the common signal had been needed and that its absence had been a choice. Dudu looked at the red light blinking and stored the fact the way you store a screw that might be useful later. Discreet, easy to ignore, but real and functional, and above all common. Autumn arrived slowly. Mornings in Milpitas grew cooler, and Dudu began wearing a light jacket on the walk to the car before entering the building and changing into anti-static fabric. On the radio, news talked about tech stocks rising, new companies opening offices in Palo Alto, an optimism that seemed not to include those who spent the entire day behind masks and caps, ensuring silicon came out clean. In October, the company completed the outsourcing of another sector, and some familiar faces disappeared. The cafeteria grew quieter, as if even the clatter of utensils had been reduced. Linda said, during a break, that she had seen Hector once at a market in Berryessa, pushing a cart, looking at the floor. She said nothing more, because sometimes what weighs doesn't fit into a sentence. Dudu nodded, and that same week, did something that didn't fix the world and still change part of it. He asked Linda for Hector's contact phone number, saying only that it was for corridor business. Linda wrote on a piece of paper and folded it twice before handing it over, like someone passing a fragile part. Knowing paper was also a risk, but out there outside the critical area, it was still allowed. On Saturday, October 19th, late in the morning, Dudu drove to a self-service laundromat near King Road in East San Jose, because the address Linda had given was for an apartment complex where many people moved quickly and where mail didn't always reach. He brought a bag with 2 empty lunch containers and a jar of oranges, an attempt not to arrive empty-handed. Hector was there, sitting on a plastic chair, watching the drum spin. He was without a uniform, but the fatigue was the same, the kind of fatigue that doesn't depend on clothing. The conversation was short because tired men tend to speak economically and because life at that point had no room for detours. Dudu didn't apologize or try to explain the past as if it were a spreadsheet. He only said that a group at the plant was gathering referrals for openings at other smaller factories in the region, including in Fremont and at a supplier in Sunnyvale, and that a name with real cleanroom experience was worth more than corridor rumors. Hector listened without lifting his eyes much, as if afraid hope was a dangerous thing. But he wrote down on a piece of paper Dudu's pager number and the name of the contact Dudu had gotten from an old maintenance technician. When the machine stopped, Hector pulled out the still-warm clothes and, before leaving, put 2 orange slices he had brought for himself into Dudu's jar. There was no punchline. There was a gesture, and that was enough. The way things sometimes are on the floor, where what sustains you isn't always said. In November, small things began to fit together in a way that didn't feel like a miracle, just well-done work repeated, with the patience of someone who knows the process only improves when routine regains an outline. The corridor spreadsheet began to have fewer gaps because Linda and Dudu, along with 2 more operators on the night shift, agreed in writing on a minimum standard. 3 required lines, always the same: machine status, lots on hold, particle alert, with time and initials, as if initials were a form of presence and also of protection. The coordinator, pressured by his own waste numbers and by questions coming from above when yield fell, stopped treating it as stubbornness and began accepting it as routine, because when the pocket feels it, theory tends to give way. The red light that blinked at 4 p.m. began to be respected without argument, not out of nostalgia, but out of usefulness. It made the corridor breathe in the same rhythm for a second. The company, feeling in its pocket the cost of the lot lost in July, authorized a discrete change in the shift change procedure: 10 paid minutes of formal overlap, with the signature of the person handing off and the person receiving, as if 2 signatures could replace a whistle, but at least they created shared responsibility and a record that didn't depend on memory or individual courage. It wasn't broad justice. It was a real adjustment, and on the factory floor, real adjustments were what kept families moving with less risk of falling. On November 15th, a Friday with a clear sky and a light chill, Dudu finished a shift with the red light blinking at 4 p.m. He filled out the log carefully, left the bench clean, closed the rack, and passed the pen to the next operator, as if the pen were part of the procedure and as if the gesture said, without needing to say it, that the line continued. The handoff was almost calm. Outside, in the parking lot, he saw the low sun hit the hoods of cars and heard, from somewhere distant, the sound of a truck on the avenue. It wasn't a whistle, but it was a world sound. He stood still for a few seconds before getting into the car, as if marking the end of the day on his own, and then drove along 237 toward Milpitas, with his hands still remembering the texture of the gloves and the tightness of the hood elastic, and with the feeling that, at least that day, the work had ended where it should. Near the end of the year, near Christmas, the plant installed a low, audible signal for shift changes. Almost a beep, discreet enough not to offend the idea of modernity, but firm enough to gather eyes for a second and synchronize the corridor. It didn't come with a party or a speech. It came with a short memo, signed by a manager no one saw, talking about standardization and handoff improvement. Even so, in the corridor, the beep did what the yellow light had done before. It reminded them that the place was collective, that time could have an edge, and that an edge was not a luxury. That same week, Dudu received on his pager a number he didn't recognize. He called from the outside phone and heard Hector's voice, steadier than in October. Hector had gotten a position at a smaller company in Fremont, on an assembly line that didn't pay as much as the old one, but had a defined shift and a present supervisor, and he would start in January. He said he needed a formal reference, someone to confirm he was careful with procedure. Dudu went to HR the following Monday and, with the old warning still in his file, asked anyway to record the reference in writing, with date and role, the way HR accepted. HR accepted, perhaps wanting to close cycles, perhaps realizing that the cost of losing experienced people was greater than the cost of admitting the floor had been right about small things that prevented big losses. The lot lost in July did not come back, and Hector's firing remained a hard mark in the plant's memory, proof that some consequences do not undo themselves. But what came after stopped being only silence and fear. The team learned to protect itself with simple procedures and practical agreements, and the company, out of self-interest, returned at least a piece of what it had taken away. A common signal, a recognized minute, a shift change that didn't depend on guessing or individual courage. Dudu kept going back and forth along US 101, carrying in his body the habit of closing tasks before the end, but now with a low beep in the background, like a thread stitching the corridor. In the last week of December, on a cold, clear afternoon, he left the clean room, returned the coverall to the locker, washed his hands calmly at the outside sink, and as he crossed the parking lot, he saw Linda wave from afar with a bag of simple gifts from the cafeteria, saw two newer operators laugh under their caps still in the gowning area, and heard the beep mark the end of the shift without hurry, firm and small. Enough for the day to end where it should end, and for each person to go home, with the quiet sense that the work, however invisible it was, still had room for a little order and for some care between people. If this story stayed with you, please consider liking the video. It helps these quiet, often overlooked stories reach more people who value them. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to remain connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd also like to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Our audience spans countries, generations, and experiences, all joined by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.